Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Perhaps science is not as neutral as one might at first think. We often think of the scientific method as being neutral, as not having any moral force of its own. And yet I think that science does take us in directions. Science suggests a whole way of viewing the world, I think. Science tells us, for example, that human intelligence ought to be used for bettering the human race, that it is good to expand our intellectual horizons, that it's good to experiment and to move forward. I mean, that's one place where immediately it seems to me that science introduces certain values into the whole equation.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of science and moral questions. Here's Father Bacik.
Well, Tom, I understand that you've been making demands to be on the program here and claiming that I often don't give my guests much time to talk and so on. And so I thought I would go along with that and allow you to take the lead. So what do you want to talk about tonight?
Well, I was going to bring some slides and talk about my recent vacation to Kansas City, but the slides were destroyed in a car fire. And I decided instead that perhaps, since most of my life is lived in a frivolous way, that I ought to try to grasp some of the hard facts of life and maybe talk about ethics. Because I find in my profession as a MD that I'm forced through the technology that's come down to me through the gifts of science and applied science. I am forced into positions where technology somehow goes against the grain of my humanity. For example, what comes to mind as a broad topic we might discuss is one of the problems I think of science today is that it creates problems that the world has really no experience with. The ultimate problem it's created in our century is the availability of total destruction of the human race through nuclear war. On a more familiar plane for me is just the technology that serves the human machine and keeps the human machine going well past perhaps the usefulness of the human mind that's encased in the human machine. That's a little nod to Plato there, too. So I think that we ought to maybe discuss some of the problems of science, how it's going to handle the developments that it creates, and perhaps a place where religion can serve science in a very healthy and instructive way. I think if I were practicing in a larger city, I might bring you around on rounds someday, and maybe bring you to an ICU and there show you what would be the typical cases of perhaps a person being kept alive on a respirator, or maybe a stroke patient that really has lost all sense of himself. No one can communicate with him, but nonetheless his heart and lungs breathe and so forth.
Well, I think, Tom, that does sound like an interesting topic for us to deal with, the question of religion and science from an ethical viewpoint, the kind of moral questions raised by science. One thing that strikes me right away is that perhaps science is not as neutral as one might at first think. We often think of the scientific method as being neutral, as not having any moral force of its own. And yet I think that science does take us in directions. Science suggests a whole way of viewing the world, I think. Science tells us, for example, that human intelligence ought to be used for bettering the human race. That it is good to expand our intellectual horizons, that it's good to experiment and to move forward. And that's one place where immediately it seems to me that science introduces certain values into the whole equation. I think that perhaps science also has built-in values or direction in terms of the kind of world that it creates. If we compare, for example, the Western world where science has dominated with the Eastern world, I think one might begin to get a little bit of perception of that. So in the Western world, we have produced an industrial kind of society where bureaucracies are very important. We focused in on more on the external world because science deals well with that and science can control it. It seems very often that that has been done at the expense of the inward life, or what we often call the spiritual life. Again, if we think of the Eastern world, that where the real question has not been so much how to dominate nature or shape the world. The question has been more, how can I achieve an authentic self-realization? How can I learn how to control my own self and my own reactions to the world? That's why we have such great emphasis in the East on the religious disciplines, on asceticism and on meditation practices. The real interest there is not so much in how I can shape my environment, but how I can learn subjectively to deal with it, to master it from within. So again, what I'm suggesting is that this, what appears to be neutrality about science, well, it's just a way of investigating the world or creating hypotheses and trying to make the world run better, really has a value system built in, or at least tendencies towards creating a certain kind of world. In this case, a world that has to be technologized, in which the world has to be put under the sway of standard ways of doing things. I mean, I don't think it's accidental in the Western world that we end up with a factory system where people are doing tedious jobs over and over, because that becomes the efficient way of producing things. I don't think it's accidental that we have a world of advertising, for example, because advertising is necessary in order to create demand for the products that the industrial society produces. And I don't think it's accidental that we live in a bureaucracy where we have trouble getting at the centers of power and where we feel very often that we're robbed of our dignity. I think the scientific revolution has moved us in that direction. And what was it Max Weber talked about? The iron cage that we put ourselves in. That he was rather pessimistic about where we were going as an industrialized society. And I think many people perhaps share that. I don't want to come across in my remarks as being totally negative towards science, because I think that obviously science's value of bettering the human race, or somehow creating a more humane society in which we can live, or solving our outstanding external problems, I think that is all to the good. And I think that it is part of human intelligence to try to master the world. And the kind of awe that science brings to the whole task is a wonderful human emotion and reaction. So I would want to say that science has an ambiguity about it, that it moves in two directions. One, out of my Christian theological framework, I would want to celebrate all of its abilities to free people from disease, from want. All of that seems to me to be a powerful positive impulse, as well as its whole sense of awe that it creates in the face of the world. But on the other hand, I think there are values built into it that I would want to begin to question. The values of consumerism and materialism and loss of individuality and pollution and the ability to destroy our world. All of that needs to be put into some sort of moral framework. Well, that, I would say, maybe is perhaps a way of responding to your opening question in terms of a theological framework. And maybe that leaves us in a position to talk a lot more about specific issues.
Well, I think I might take exception. I'm not sure that all the evils of present-day society are somehow direct products of science. I don't think they're the value system of science. I have the feeling that the problem arises that pure science, as an outlet for man's curiosity, leads man to discoveries, leads man to ability to control all the natures but his own. Science somehow fails miserably when it comes to controlling human nature. Science can offer ways of dealing with the problems of the world as we see it today, but we might think of them as rather inhuman. You can give people drugs, or you can do surgery on people's brains and somehow make them more peaceful and better adapted to the society that's grown out of the technological explosion. But I think the essential question... But
before you go on, could I just make a response to that and say that I believe that I could be positive about it. I think of one area where I think that I've changed my opinion a little bit, and that is what I notice in the area of psychiatry, where there is so much drug giving these days in order to alleviate human problems. I think there was a time in which I was more negative on that and thought the psychiatrists ought to be spending their 50 minutes with their patients exploring their psychic activity and so on. But I noticed that some people that I'm counseling lately are going to psychiatrists. They talk to them for 15 or 20 minutes. They give them an antipsychotic drug or an antidepressant drug, and it really does seem to do some good. I mean, it seems to create an atmosphere where the people can deal better with their own problems. It would seem to me there again that I could end up being positive about the results of science and applaud that effort and say, go to it. Let's find better drugs. Let's find more out about psychosomatic problems. Let's try to see if there are not ways that we can help people to cope better in this way. I don't think it's an ultimate solution. I wouldn't want to see all problems resolved that way, but I certainly talk to some people who seem to really benefit from that. I guess the more that we find out about the biological base for a lot of psychic disorders, maybe the more we would be in tune with the need for that kind of usage of drugs to alter people's consciousness. So I put that forward as an argument on your side again, in saying that I don't want to be, or we don't want to be totally negative on what science ends up doing. But I would extend it even further than you said, right into the realm of the human as well. In fact, I'd like to even say that much as I dislike B.F. Skinner's ideas about psychology and the general behaviorism that results, I think again here that there are good things that happen, that a lot of what he says could be used in educational circles, that the creating of the proper environment clearly is important to learning, that a lot of times if we can create a good situation, we can get people to behave better. I would like to learn a lot from Skinner about that. My problem comes when he wants to give a total answer, when he wants behaviorism to be a religion, when he tries to tell me in a book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, that freedom has no role to play at all in the human enterprise. Then that bothers me, and then I think that the theologian has to step in and criticize that. So I want to extend your own argument in a way right into the realm of the human and say that seems to me that science indeed does an awful lot of good right there as well, and that I just don't want it to somehow become a total world view or co-opt the whole question of values. The philosophers and the theologians and the people of common sense and goodwill need to have something to say about that whole debate as well.
And also, I think we should see that science and the world of ethics and morality aren't antagonistic. I think it's a matter of a foot race in which science has gotten to jump, basically, and that it's spawned off a number of situations and abilities in our society that religion and morality and ethical inquiry haven't been able to catch up with yet. And the question really is, will we have enough time to prevent ourselves from self-destructing before somehow on a global basis we solve these problems that technology has given us? I think I go along with Buckminster Fuller in thinking that it's not a retreat from technology, but a increase in technology that will save us from technology. I just think it's got to be that way to solve the problem. But religion, morality, ethics have to somehow accelerate their growth and influence in the world in order to prevent this discontinuity and advancement from blowing us up.
I find that to be a perceptive comment, especially coming from one in the medical field or really a layman in the world of theology. But I think you give us a good challenge here and tell us exactly what needs to be done. The whole process of moral thinking has to be speeded up and related more to the real problems that we face and the global issues. I think so often morality has been so private and centered in on the individual salvation of the soul and worried about personal kind of moral problems, when we've got these larger issues that really have to be addressed, and the churches and the theologians and religious leaders do have to speak out on this. I'm thinking of the question of nuclear warfare and what that might mean, and the need to have an input into this. I mean, just the pure idea that we've got these weapons and then, well, therefore war becomes thinkable, perhaps that has to be challenged by the theologians. I find a lot of comfort, I think, in the fact of the pronouncements of the recent popes working out of my own Catholic tradition, who have talked about the need to limit armaments and so on. I think that it's interesting in the United States that many Catholic bishops have come out recently with pacifist kind of statements and in relationship to nuclear weaponry. And I think that perhaps we begin to see a movement in this direction. I know one author, Arthur Jones, has recently written in one of the popular Catholic papers, National Catholic Reporter, about the idea that he thinks we're just on the edge of a new age, when the common person is going to begin to take more seriously social responsibilities and see the need to make moral judgments on these great questions. I'm not so sure I'm as optimistic as he is about seeing this trend occurring, but I do know that we definitely need that. We can't, as citizens of our country, for example, simply be sitting there saying, my country, right or wrong, or whatever our government decides, that is what has to be done. Seems to me that is an abdication of a proper role of citizenship, that is not any kind of true patriotism at all, but that we have to become judges of what is going on. We have to have opinions. We have to inform ourselves of these great global kinds of moral issues. So at least in that area, I would think that your comments are well taken, that moral theology, or the religion in general, has to speed up the effort to catch up with the technology, because we're not going to stop technology. We're not, and I don't think we want to do that as Christian people. It seems to me that would be opposed to the gospel ideal of human beings being stewards of the earth and having the responsibility to work with God in creating a better world. That is what is really needed. So it's, in my mind, it's more a matter of guiding technology, of getting an input into what we're going to do with it, of trying to maximize its good potential and to play down its potentials for destruction and so on.
I think that the scientific approach to spreading the word might be thought of here. I guess I'm thinking of the medium of television. It's one way to increase the sense of global village. I think I wrote once in a paper for the class on Teilhard that science should try to neighborhoodize, using one of these awful neologisms, that we ought to try to develop as soon as we can in the world a sense that we're all neighbors and that we're one. And I think that all the negative ideas that used to in former times be rather positive, nationalism and this sort of idea is got to be seen as an outmoded thing, and perhaps we're tending towards a world religion. That might be something that will be a new development in time, and man will see that he has to embrace the global vision. And I think television, which is one of the finest products of science, may be a means to this, but we also need the ardent spokesman from the theological sphere to give the message as best intact.
I think that what you said is well taken about the television. I think there's probably a way in which we are more in touch with the larger evil in our world than any other generation has been. We know starvation. We know the evils of war because it's brought right into our homes through the medium of television. And I think in that way it really performs an important function for us. Again, many of the religious people are learning to use the media of television properly or well in order to get their message across. There does seem to be a constructive use of that kind of technology, and I think just by its very existence it is educating us to this larger world. And I think that my mentor, Karl Rahner, thinks that we are indeed just on the verge of a new era in religion. He thinks for the first time that our own Catholic community is in a position of becoming a worldwide community in the sense that it takes seriously the cultures around the world, so that we will find an African version of Christianity or a distinctively Chinese type of Christianity. And so that begins to move in this direction of the global village that McLuhan talked about and that you are trying to delineate there. Tom, I don't want to take you entirely away from your own field here. Shall we try to spend a little bit of time on the medical kinds of ethics that you were raising earlier? You said you'd take me through a ward and so on and show me these kinds of problems. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, I think it's probably a familiar example many families have experienced it is the aged person that becomes dependent, and then not only on the family but ultimately becomes dependent on machines. And then there's a question of, do we keep the person alive or do we not? So here you have a classic problem that science has created. In the past, these people died and there was no problem with it. Now, their lives are prolonged, but their useful life has been lost already. Scientists have no answers for these things. Doctors are ill prepared for it. Most doctors handle such conditions by ignoring them or downplaying them, and basically because they have no training with it. They learn in the field and they make a lot of mistakes. They do not have to address the issues. I think medical schools are catching up with educating their doctors for situations like this. And there are trends now where they bring in people from other fields, a philosopher, a religious figure, to help deal with an issue at hand. I'm not sure that we want to turn our back on technology. It is saving lives and helping things, but there seems to be a greater need here for religion to define things like when can people decide to die, when are people dead, what is the proper use of the body at a certain point.
I think that you've raised a terrific moral question, and I certainly can't go into it. I wouldn't even be capable of responding in any kind of complete way, but the distinction that we've often used in moral theology is between extraordinary and ordinary means of keeping people alive. We've said that we should use ordinary means and do not have to use extraordinary means. I would think, immediately think of extraordinary means as being something like iron lungs or those kinds of complicated support systems. I think in the Karen Quinlan case we saw an example of this where they, I think working out of the Catholic tradition, made this decision that to shut off some of this machinery, even though they thought at the time that Karen would die. Of course, as people know, she didn't really die after that. But I think it was based on that moral principle of not having to use extraordinary means. I think today that people are beginning to try to find a different language for that, and maybe talking about the use of proportionate means to keep people alive. And the proportion very often would be in relationship to the hope for this person to live a really human life. So that maybe something that would even seem to be a rather ordinary medical procedure would become extraordinary, so that if we think of a person who's going to die shortly anyway, and all indications are in that direction, they're simply keeping them alive for a few more hours or a few more days through an IV in the arm, that perhaps a family would decide, well, we can take that IV out, and would do that on the grounds that this is not a proportionate means. It's not extraordinary in the old sense, but it certainly isn't proportionate to the situation here. That why not let the person die now, as they're going to do in a few hours or in a few days anyway. So there's really complicated issues, and I really have to be careful not to try to go too quickly over that and to say things that would be misleading. But I think we believe that God is the author of all life. We must respect it. But on the other hand, physical life as we know it is not an absolute in the Christian tradition, because we think that death is a doorway into a new and better life. We've always said that at times it's possible, for example, heroically to give up their own life to save somebody else, an example of where physical existence as we know it is not an absolute. Well, that clearly is not going to answer all the kind of problems that you suggested there, and it gets to be so complicated, especially if you would move into something like genetic engineering and so on, and that would raise all kind of questions. Tom, I think that the whole issue that you've raised is an important one, and we've tried to see various aspects of it, and I think you've made some telling comments on that. I just like to thank you for the input that you've made on that. I know that often I end up kidding you in various ways, and maybe people get the wrong impression of your role in all of this. You and I have been friends for a long time, and I really appreciate your insights that come from your own medical background and science orientation. And I think that you have a lot to say about that, and I appreciate the fact that you have taken time to do that. And I think that if we try to pull together some of the things that we've seen in this particular conversation that we've had, my contribution to it seems to be the notion that science indeed has a direction to it. And it leads us in a certain way. It's helped to create the kind of culture that we live. In fact, I think you could make the point that the rise of science has been the major contributing factor to the way we think of ourselves and the way we think of our world. And from my own religious perspective, I would want to be able to critique that and say, hey, there's all kind of good things. Look at what you doctors can do now. You can save people's lives. You can help people to function who would have been disabled in the past. You can even change people's state of consciousness through drugs in a positive kind of way. All of that needs to be lauded, and I think we want to encourage that kind of effort. On the other hand, I'm very conscious of the way that science has perhaps in many ways helped to produce a more destructive situation. And so we've talked about pollution and the possibility of destroying our whole world through nuclear weaponry. And all of these kinds of things I think that we have to critique from a religious perspective. I would like to keep the dialogue open. I think it's important for scientists and theologians to keep talking, but I think it's also important for the average person to try to inform themselves on both sides of these issues, to have some sense of the complexity of the scientific world, and also to get a more adult understanding of the religion so that they're able to think seriously and clearly about these great issues presented to us by the world of science.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. The topic of this week's Reflections was science and moral questions. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.